If you're looking for the fall of our society, all you really have to do is post a picture of the Blackmagic Pixis 6K, leave it anywhere on social media, and wait for 20 minutes because, well, the comments are going to come out. Now, a couple of days ago, I did make a video about the announcement of the brand new Blackmagic Pixis 6K. It seems to be a camera that a lot of us had asked for, and in my excitement, and also something I was doing anyways, I'm selling my Red Komodo X to actually use the Pixis for a lot of things that I was using on my Red Komodo X. Now, that came with a little bit of mixed commenting and a lot of slander for some reason, but in today's video, I want to talk about what things I really like about the Pixis after using it for a bit at NAB, and also addressing why I feel like the fall of our society is in some of these camera announcements, but we'll just get there. Now, one thing I do like about the Pixis 6K is that it does adopt pretty much everything on the sensor level between the Blackmagic full frame and this new box style camera. I'm not going to read out the spec sheets of this camera. If you want to see some of them, they're all over the place. But one thing that did happen when the full frame 6K came out was a lot of people were complaining about its form factor. It still had that pocket design, which wasn't necessarily conducive to rigging things out, and it became a little bit annoying in a general sigh from everybody because it didn't feel like anything new actually came out in terms of how to format this camera with a very powerful sensor. Blackmagic kind of just said, hold my beer for a couple of months, and then at NAB, they released the new box design and the box style. This design is made to be modular. You're going to have a bunch of different accessory companies that are going to help with rigging this guy, and for the most part, I thought this was kind of the answer that everyone was looking for. Except there's a ton of different complaints and criticisms about this body design. The first thing is going to be the screen, which is a major point of contention for a lot of people. Now, I actually had a chance to not only ask most people on the design team and actually interview one of them in a live stream, but the screen placement was actually a really tough decision from the design team themselves. The screen's a little bit different than an FX3 or a Panasonic S5, where normally those screens are going to be a lot smaller. If you want to fit a whole Blackmagic design screen, which typically are going to be on the bigger side, put it on a swivel and put it on the side, not only was it going to end up being a power delivery issue, but on the flip side, it might be a little bit cumbersome to actually balance it on the gimbal when it's fully flipped out. Just like you guys, I wish we had a little bit more options on that screen that's going to be fixed to the side. However, I'm not going to lie to myself and say that I'm not going to rig this out and use my own monitors on there. Now, it's on the operator side, which makes it a little bit easier on sticks. If you're on a Dana Dolly, an Easy Rig, there's actually more ways where this actually works out for you than it doesn't. I could say it's going to be a little bit annoying on a gimbal, but outside of that, I think it's going to work on pretty much everything else, and especially because you're more than likely going to rig it out. Now, another thing that we're going to talk about is going to be on the sensor level, which is going to be the rolling shutter. Now, to be fair, the Sony Burano also has a rolling shutter, and I think the readout is actually really similar from the Pixis to the Burano, and despite the fact of the opinions of a bunch of people on the internet, there's still a lot of professionals that pick up this camera and don't really mind the rolling shutter readout. That being said, on the Blackmagic 6K, which the Burano can't do, is you actually store the gyro data on there, so if you do use that stabilization in DaVinci Resolve, which they give you for free, twice and eliminate a lot of that jello if you're going to be panning side to side. I'll just show you an example. This is going to be what it's going to look like when you just have it straight out of the camera, you grade a little bit, and you have that jello wobbling in the straight lines. And then when I turn on the gyro data, it kind of goes away. Now, I have no horse in this race, and I'm definitely not an electrical engineer, but one of the other complaints was going to be the V-mount battery plate instead of using BPU batteries. This is kind of going to go into the price of this camera. There isn't a sub $5,000 camera that has a native V-mount plate at the back, let alone one that's going to be $3,000. I think in that regard, I feel like the V-mount plate was going to be expensive and the camera would be more pricey, but then at the same time, the Sony FX6 also doesn't have a V-mount plate. Tilta already made a solution in order to use V-mount plates, and also with the Blackmagic cameras across the board, you always had to rig them out. I don't necessarily think that's the worst thing in the world, especially at the price point of this camera. It kind of leaves you a bit of budget to fix that anyways. Now, one I can understand a little bit better is going to be the lack of an HDMI and an SDI in its place. However, SDI is a more stable connection, but also SDI monitors nowadays are a lot more affordable than they were like 2 years ago. Before, you had to spend a minimum of like $1,000 to find a decent SDI monitor, but now you could pick up like a Shinobi SDI, or some of the Hollyland versions have SDIs as well, and they're a lot cheaper than they used to be. So not only are you going to get a better connection and SDI to your monitor, but also the monitors that are available are a lot cheaper. In fact, Blackmagic actually dropped the price of their own monitors, which still, again, with that $3,000 price tag, leaves you the budget to go and pick that up and rig out those problems that you might have had at the initial announcement. All of the cameras that we have right now, we all rig out. Cinema cameras are, by and large, going to be rigged out. There's very few of them that aren't going to have a bunch of accessories to solve the problems we have, which was kind of the point. In fact, a lot of the box-style cameras, they all need to be rigged out. My Red Komodo X needs a cage and a bunch of accessories to solve the problems that it has on the body on its own. If you want to get something like the Kinfinity cameras, you still have to buy the accessories externally and rig that camera out in order for it to be used. There's very few cameras, and in fact, box cameras that you could just take out out and start working with right away. At the end of the day, a lot of people that are going to buy a Blackmagic camera, particularly anything in that sort of entry-level market, you're gonna rig it out with accessories. And a lot of the problems that people had with the Pixus can be solved by rigging it out or the software that already comes for free in box. And if all of that doesn't jive with you, Blackmagic said it themselves. If the camera's not for you, don't buy it. I think what ends up happening when we see different announcements on YouTube, and especially when you see people excited about it, some folks tend to take those things personally and think that it's a direct call out for you to drop everything you're doing and buy that camera. For me personally, I think I'm more excited about the filmmaker that I was 3 years ago at this camera's release, because you would have never got all of those features in one camera for that price point. And I do think that for the things that I use my Red Komodo X for, which a lot of times with my client gigs, with doing Google ads and stuff like that, I don't necessarily need it to be a $10,000 rig. I can get more than that done on something like the Pixus 6K, which in that respect, I'll just give myself back the money for the Red Komodo X and use a Pixus for the exact same thing. And overall, in terms of the output, I'm not gonna notice a gigantic difference. I already said this before, where if you put the Red Komodo X right beside the Pixus and I do a decent grade on either one, I'm not going to be able to tell the difference between the two. In fact, I've had people grade my footage on my Blackmagic full frame and my Red Komodo X, and I really couldn't tell you which one was which. And for the most part, I don't think a lot of you guys could either. In fact, an experiment that Jason Morris did over on his channel was he shot a short documentary on a camera that nobody was able to guess. Everybody was guessing it was an FX6 or a Red Komodo X or a bunch of other cameras, and it ended up being the A6000. And for the most part, if a lot of image quality sticklers are going to be able to say they're going to tell the difference, I don't necessarily think that's all the way true. Once it's already on the internet with the compression, or once it's delivered to your client, I don't think they're going to care. So in that regard, I'd rather just keep the money, and if I need to, rental houses exist. And a lot of people that own Red cameras or Arri cameras or just bigger cinema cameras know that if you really need the tools, just go rent it, which means you don't have to own it, which also means if you have a camera that can be used for everyday use, you can keep the money instead. So everybody just calm down on the whole Red Komodo X being sold thing. Now, the $3,000 price tag turns you off a little bit and you're already a DaVinci Resolve user. This camera actually technically became even cheaper. Now, if you want to buy DaVinci Resolve Studio, you're looking at about like $200 to $300, and you actually get 2 keys in most of the Blackmagic cameras you're going to end up buying. If you have DaVinci Resolve Studio already and you sell both the keys, now that $3,000 camera is like $2,400 to $2,500, which if you were going to tell me that you're going to get a 6K open gate full frame sensor for $2,400, there are so many things that I would be willing to give up, like having a fixed screen on the side, that would make that a viable option, and I would just rig out and figure out the rest. I think some people might also introduce the idea that you should just buy a used camera instead and don't buy the Pixus, and on some level I actually agree with that. However, that criticism has actually nothing to do with the Pixus in general. That could be applied to pretty much any camera that's been available for the last little while, and it's also going to be region dependent, and also there's a finite amount of people selling their cameras versus people that want to buy one. So I don't necessarily know if that's the greatest advice in the world. However, if you want to buy a used camera and you want to spend the same amount of money, go ahead and do that. It kind of goes back to that thing where if this camera doesn't necessarily fit your needs, don't buy it. There's nothing I could say to convince you to buy it. There's nothing anybody could say to convince you to buy it, because at the end of the day, if you're self-aware of your use case and what money's in your wallet, there's no internet video that's going to be able to tell you otherwise, or at least there shouldn't be. Hot take, sit down, be seated, be calm. There are some things that the Pixus technically on paper does better than my Red Komodo X. For one, it's a full frame sensor, which the Red Komodo X isn't, it's Super 35. And two, it's also open gate. Now, you only get 36 frames a second in your slow motion, but at the end of the day, if you do want to shoot vertical and horizontal footage, you actually have a better chance of being able to crop those things in for multi-purpose use than you would on the Red Komodo X. Which also means that it still supports anamorphic shooting as well. And also, the Remus lenses that came out last year are also super affordable. And when you have the budget that you have for this camera, which is way less than the Komodo X, you can get a full set of Blazer anamorphics and that camera and still not come close to how much the Red Komodo cost with just the body itself. The second thing is the Red Komodo X doesn't necessarily have audio outputs in there. You do have to have a LEMO cable and use an XLR audio module, where on the Pixus you only need a mini XLR to a full-size XLR in order to get professional sound. I find the mini XLR to full-size XLR a little bit easier to work with because I have broken my LEMO cable more than once. They're really super thin and tiny, and they're very easy to break or get ripped up. On top of that, at the quarter of the price, one of these two cameras have a 3.5mm jack. And I'll let you guess which one it is. Now, the Pixus also has dual card slots with a CF Express Type B. Now, I'm somebody that's a little bit paranoid. I've had cards fail on me before. The Angel cards are great, but I do like having the extra security. Now, I don't necessarily have a pulse on whether or not you could do relay recording. However, that might be something in a firmware update that's pretty easy to do, and that way I can actually store more footage on my Blackmagic versus the Red Komodo X. Or, if you're someone that's paranoid like me, I actually have a backup that I could write to as well. And for what it's worth, complaints aside, the screen resolution on the Pixus is going to be better than the Red Komodo X. Now, the Red Komodo X has a better play screen, but when I rig it up and it's underneath my top handle, it's a little bit annoying. And at the same time, the viewing space on that screen with all the menus and stuff on there makes the image experience incredibly cumbersome. And for better or for worse, the Pixus does have a better looking screen. It's much larger, it's a higher resolution. If you look at it from the side, it's a little bit weird, but I feel like that once you have the production model, we'll be able to tell whether or not that still is the same thing. Personally, for me, I think it's kind of a misnomer anyways. I'm gonna put a monitor on both of these cameras, and whatever monitor I'm gonna use is what I'm gonna be looking at. However, if I have to decide which screen is gonna be a little bit better, placement aside, the Blackmagic objectively has a better resolution screen. And the last thing, and I feel like we keep talking about this, it's gonna be the price. Again, if you wanna sell those DaVinci Resolve keys, you have more money in your pocket if you're already a user of that software. But even then, the Red Komodo X costs 3 times as much as a Pixus, and all the accessories for the Komodo cost more than the Blackmagic Pixus 6K. But at the same time, even considering the price point, I think people have things a little bit warped and a little bit backwards. Of course, a cheaper camera means it's more viable for a lot of people that are beginners, a lot of starting filmmakers, in order to get onto this guy and start shooting it in small form productions or small teams, which might be the reason why some of the gripes exist in terms of its body design. However, I might introduce you into another line of thinking, that the price of a camera isn't necessarily indicative to the scope of the production it can be used on. It should more so be weighed on its function. By the logic of saying cheap camera means small production, then the Creator would have never been made on the Sony FX3. The reason why they picked that camera wasn't necessarily because it was $5,000 and they wanted to spend more money, but it was because what it could do with the resources that they had, and they could spend that money elsewhere. Now, it has 2 base ISO, with one being 12,800, which worked really well for the low light scenes. Also, because of the style of that camera, the way they wanted to shoot things, the FX3 made more sense. Even on an $80 million budget, a $4,000 camera was still viable because what it can do, not necessarily based on how much it costs. The $3,000 price tag on the Pixus doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be fixed in a particular type of shoot, because it's capable of doing things that are far bigger than its actual scope. If you want to shoot 6K open gate RAW and pretty much anything else, that's more than viable enough to do a lot of things in a lot of professional settings. Just because it's priced cheaper doesn't necessarily mean it's a baby toy or for baby productions. You can still do a lot with it. In fact, in the next month or so, we're going to shoot an entire film on it. Unfortunately, I feel like we're holding the Pixus, which is a cinema camera, by a mirrorless camera's yardstick. It's not the Sony FX3, it's not the S5X2 by Panasonic, it's not a Nikon Z8, and it's definitely not the Red Komodo X. The Blackmagic team put a lot of effort and a lot of thought into this camera, and actually keeping solo and independent filmmakers in mind. But at the end of the day, if it's not the camera for you, again, don't buy it. And if you're someone who's going to be a professional contrarian and go on YouTube and start talking about how you shouldn't listen to YouTubers talk about this camera, but also that's in the form of a YouTube video that's monetized with sponsors on it or affiliate links, I feel like that's just a pot calling kettle black, but that's a whole different conversation. I actually really don't like making these kinds of videos. I don't like having these sort of rant videos or these anti-rant videos. I do like just talking about gear that's interesting, using it as an operator, and giving my thoughts. But this particular release has caused a lot of vitriol and a lot of weird comments in the last little bit, so much so that I feel like the most offensive things that have been said to me on the internet is actually within this product release week, which is wild to me. Where I'm just gonna say, if you don't like this type of content, if you don't like camera releases and people talking about gear, don't watch it. There's going to be so many people that are going to pull you in different directions, where you and your choices are going to be the thing at the end of the day that's going to decide what to watch. On top of that, you could also just choose not to watch this type of content in YouTube and it'll never show it to you again. My thing is this: if I'm somebody that's trying to lose weight, I'm not going to watch the Food Network then scream at the TV the fact that the program that I chose to watch is on. That being said, a lot of those things are a different conversation. I didn't necessarily like making this type of video, but this is going to be the last kind of Pixus video I'm going to talk about before I actually use it on set in a real professional situation where you'll get some of my thoughts while using it as a camera operator. That being said, if you want to see some of the other videos, some of the questions were answered in the live stream that I'll put over here, and as well, if you want to just see my initial reaction and why everyone's upset in the first place, well, you can see this video over here that talks about me selling the Red Komodo X. That being said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.